Successful Philanthropy. I'm your host, Jean Shafiroff. This show is designed to highlight the work of philanthropic leaders here in the United States and then beyond. With us today, a very special guest, Kerry Kennedy. Kerry is the president of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. She's an author, a human rights advocate, a mother, and an all-round fascinating woman. Before I introduce Kerry, a few words from Robert F. Kennedy, her father, on human rights.
Whenever any American's life is taken unnecessarily, whether it is done in the name of the law or in defiance of the law, whenever we do this, then the whole nation is degraded. And yet it goes on and on and on in this country of ours. Too often we excuse those who are willing to build their own lives on the shattered dreams of other human beings. Some accuse others of rioting and inciting riots have by their own conduct invited them. This is the violence of institutions, indifference, inaction, and decay. This is the violence that afflicts the poor, that poisons relations between men because their skin has different colors. This is the slow destruction of a child by hunger and schools without books. This is the breaking of a man's spirit by denying him the chance to stand as a father and as a man amongst other men. We learn at the last to look at our brothers as alien. For when you teach a man to hate and to fear his brother, when you teach that he is a lesser man because of his color, then you also learn to confront others, not as fellow citizens, but as enemies, to be met not with cooperation, but with conquest, to be subjugated and to be mastered. We learn to share only a common fear, only a common impulse, to meet disagreement with force. But this much is clear: violence breeds violence, repression breeds retaliation, and only a cleansing of our whole society can remove this sickness from our souls. We must admit the vanity of our false distinctions and learn to find our own advancement in search for the advancement of all.
And now, our featured guest, Kerry Kennedy. Kerry, thank you so much for joining us. It is a great pleasure and honor to have you on Successful Philanthropy. Kerry, can you start by telling us a little bit about the work you do with the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights?
Human Rights. Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jean, and so great to be with you always. Of course, you are on the Leadership Council of Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, so you know this well, but we were started in 1968 to carry forward Robert Kennedy's unfinished work on social justice.
That's your dad, right?
That's my father, and we work domestically and all over the world. We really focus on three areas. One, we hold governments responsible for human rights abuses, and we do that mostly through advocacy and litigation. So in Uganda, when they passed a law that made homosexuality punishable by life in prison without parole, we sued the government and we overturned the case. We overturned the law. At any given time, we have about 35 cases and we've never lost a case. Secondly, we work on holding businesses accountable for human rights abuses. So today, when you and I were little, almost all the economies on Earth, the large economies, were run by countries. But today, 70 of the 100 largest economies are not countries, they're corporations. So as corporations have more and more control over our lives, it's increasingly important to hold them accountable for human rights abuses. And we do that through the investors in those corporations. So a few times a year, we bring together a group of about 300 people who control $7 trillion in assets managed, which is about 10% of the world's economy. And we talk to them about the impact of human rights abuses on investment outcomes. And then the third area, we think if we hold the governments responsible and we hold the corporations responsible, it's for naught unless we train the next generation of human rights defenders. And we do that through a human rights education program called Speak Truth to Power. And those are our three main programs.
Yes, and I also know you're very involved with prison reform, which is a very big subject right now. And I wanted you to talk to our audience a little bit exactly about what you're doing on prison reform, because a lot of people don't realize that many of the jails are privately operated. And can you tell us a little bit about exactly what you're doing and how it's changing lives? Because so many of those in our prisons today are very young people, and their crimes are very, very minor. So just give us a little information, please, Kerry.
Sure, thanks, Jean. So we work on bail reform. In New York, for instance, when you are accused of a crime, arrested by police, you're brought before a judge. And the judge decides if you are too dangerous to yourself or society, they remand you, they put you in jail, and they don't let you out before trial. If in the judge's view, you do not have to be remanded, then the judge will set bail. If you are wealthy, you pay the bail and go home to your family, to your school, to your lawyers, to your home, and you prepare for trial, back to your job. So when Harvey Weinstein was accused by over 90 women of sexual assault and rape, he paid $1 million bail and he was put back on the streets of New York. Why? Because he was wealthy enough to pay bail. A lot of people are not wealthy enough to pay their bail, and they are accused of much lesser crimes. For instance, earlier this year, we bailed out a woman who could not make $25 in bail, and she had been put in jail for unpaid parking tickets. So imagine that. Now, this becomes much, much worse in the age of Corona, because the jails in our country have the highest concentration rates of coronavirus of almost any place. So they're cauldrons of corona, and people like this woman are literally facing a death sentence because she could not put together $25 for the unpaid parking tickets. So we are bailing them out and trying to get legislation passed so that these minor offenses will not be jailable offenses, and so that we decarcerate our jails and prisons across the country.
I didn't know that people were actually going into prison for not paying parking tickets. That's really crazy, and it's a big burden on the system also. So I'm glad you're working there. Now, what about people who've actually committed greater crimes and might be a menace to society? Are they getting out on bail too? Because I think that's a big concern to a lot of people.
Yeah, so think about it this way. There's two pieces of this puzzle. One is where you're taken before you go to trial. In our country, you are considered innocent until you've been proven guilty. So as you're innocent, again, if a judge believes that you are a danger, a grave danger to society, they remand you and they don't let you out. So bail has nothing to do with dangerousness. Bail only has to do with wealth. You go to jail before trial only if you're too poor to pay your bail.
Mm-hmm.
After trial, if you've been adjudicated as guilty, if you've been found guilty, then you go to prison.
Mm-hmm.
So our program is not about getting people released from prison who have been adjudicated. What we're talking about is recognizing that you are innocent until proven guilty, and that our system should not be wealth-based. And of course, as you know, it's not only wealth-based, but it's race-based. So if you are a person of color, if you have Black or brown skin, then the chances of you going to jail instead of being bailed out are much, much higher.
Yes, and with everything going on this year, and racial justice being a big issue, I understand you've been involved in creating racial justice or working on racial justice for a very long time. Can you talk a little bit about exactly what you do to promote racial justice?
So one of the areas we do this is of course in the decarceration, the criminal legal system and criminal legal reform. And in another way we work on these issues is with businesses. So in the investment industry, $70 trillion industry, what percentage of that money, of that $70 trillion, goes to women and minority-owned firms, is controlled by women and minority-owned firms? You know what the answer is? 1.3%, less than 2%. Virtually everything else is controlled by old white men. So until we address the economic system, even if we completely transform policing and criminal legal reform overnight, we have to reform the economic system at the same time. So we're working with corporations and investors, big private equity companies, big pension funds, to address that issue as well.
I like that, and I think it's really very important because our country has had a serious issue with racial injustice right from our start with slavery, and slavery was one of the most horrific crimes against humanity. And unfortunately, we were active participants in this terrible crime against humanity. And so for all of us, it's a stain on our souls, slavery. And I'm glad that you're doing so much to promote racial justice. Very important issue. Kerry, I want to just divert for a minute. You're a Kennedy, and most of us, I mean, I'm a huge fan of the family, and I'm not ashamed to say your uncle, John F. Kennedy, your father, Robert Kennedy. What was it like growing up? And did you know Jacqueline Kennedy? I was a big fan of hers. I remain one. I think I've read everything about her. And then your mom, Ethel, and it seems to me all of you are doing great things. Tell me, being a Kennedy, was it an asset, or did it make life more difficult? And has it made your work easier or harder?
Oh, well, thank you for saying so many nice things. I mean, it was a wonderful, wonderful time to grow up in so very, very, very many ways. Nobody makes me more proud than my parents, my aunts and uncles, and then of course my daughters today, my nieces and nephews. Everybody is engaged in social justice one way or the other. So that's really a family value. What was it like growing up? I tell you, one of my favorite memories of my father is he would always do the same thing. I had 10 brothers and sisters. So whenever we had a battle, and there were many of them, he did the same thing. So one day I was in the tree house outside of our house in Northern Virginia. And I was playing World War II with my brother Michael, and he was the Americans and he held the upper fort. And I was the doomed Germans, and I was supposed to climb up the treehouse while he pelted me with magnolia pods, which look just like grenades, but they feel like rocks when they hit your head. And I took one too many rocks to the head, magnolia pods to the head, and I jumped out of the treehouse and ran up into the house and into my father's office and jumped in his lap with tears streaming down my face, saying, "Michael threw magnolia pods at me." And he said, "Tell me everything that happened." And I told him the whole evil story about my brother. And he said, "Well, you go get him right now." So I went and thought, "Michael, Daddy wants to see you. And not only that, the Attorney General of the United States wants to see you. Come up here." So up he went to Daddy's office. And my father said, "Kerry, tell exactly what happened. Michael, you don't interrupt." And I told him the whole saga again. And he said, "Now, Kerry, you don't interrupt. And Michael, you tell me your side of the story." And through that, I mean, it took a long time, but through that, I learned a few things. I learned that I wasn't all right, Michael wasn't all wrong. And then we had to kiss and make up and go to our rooms and read for an hour. And I learned that you need to have a justice system that everybody believes in and believes is fair. And you need to, that peace isn't something you just pray for. That peace is something that all of us have to work to make every single day of our lives. And that there's no substitute for education, for learning, for self-improvement. So I think those were important lessons my father had for me, for my siblings, and for our entire country.
I like that story, and very helpful. And no question, education is key for advancement. And I always say to young people, get an education, and that can really change your life. And I think we have to make education available to everyone and not make it so that a college education is so expensive that someone coming out of college ends up with $200,000 or $150,000 worth of loans. It's really crazy. And what about Jacqueline Kennedy as an aunt? Were you close to her? And how was it like being the little niece?
Oh, she was wonderful. She lived next door to us in Hyannisport with my cousins, Caroline and John. And, just this incredibly lovely, lively spirit. I remember we were playing a game one night and you had to describe each person. And she was described as poetry in motion. And as there was a poem that said, never person have I seen so self-composed and yet serene. And I really think that's such a great description of my aunt. She was serene, she was self-composed, and she was just always so lovely and fun and curious and wonderful to be with.
And your mom also, Ethel Kennedy, a real icon and a wonderful woman who raised a great family. I know she's still with us, and she's a little older now, and I've had the pleasure of meeting her a number of times. And you must have great memories growing up with your mother, and then, of course, your father, who died at far too young an age of an assassination.
Yeah, I mean, my mother is 92. She lives down the street from me. We have dinner several nights a week, and she's just fun and funny and, always the life of the party, and a beautiful, wonderful, extraordinary woman. She is known for joy in life and for her commitment to social justice. I remember as a child, when I was maybe 9 or 10 years old, making a bet with a friend of mine about who was in, at this time, Richard Nixon was the president of the United States, about who is more famous, Richard Nixon or Cesar Chavez. And of course, I was saying Cesar Chavez is much more famous because in our household, he was so much more important. So I think that's a reflection of my mother's values and her vision.
Yes, and now getting back to your charity, you have a big event coming up on December 17th, the Ripple of Hope Awards, and it's a very special event. I remember I try to support you every year, and really you do great things. You raise a lot of money for human rights. And what's happening this year on December 17th?
Well, we're so thrilled because we are going to be honoring Colin Kaepernick, Dr. Anthony Fauci, Dolores Huerta, who, of course, co-founded the United Farm Workers with Cesar Chavez, Dan Springer, who's the CEO of DocuSign, and Dan Schulman, who's the CEO of PayPal. And, you know, we were talking earlier about racial justice and economic justice. PayPal, within 6 weeks of George Floyd's murder, committed $550 million to income inequality issues and racial justice. So these are people who, of course, you know, we know what Dr. Fauci has done under extraordinary circumstances, really keeping the American people informed and trusting him as a leader on these issues. And Colin Kaepernick, you know, really teaching us all to take a stand by taking a knee. So I couldn't be happier.
Yes, and for our viewers who want to donate, how do we donate?
Oh, that's so nice of you to ask. Everyone's favorite question. You just go to our website, www.rfkhumanrights.org, and there's a donate page. So,
and what about people who want to volunteer? Is there a way to volunteer?
Well, you can join the Leadership Council, which you, of course, have done, Jean, and it's a wonderful group. It's got a dozen Nobel Peace Prize winners on it, leaders in the business community, some of our greatest actors like Alec and Hilaria Baldwin are on it, and Keegan Michael Key and many, many others. But we'd love to have any of your guests join us.
And Kerry, have you ever thought about running for office? You're a lawyer, you're an author, you're a human rights activist. I think you'd be perfect.
That's so sweet of you. Thanks. You know, my passion has always been on international issues, and that's what I've spent my life working on. I think when I think ahead of what President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris face, I think domestically, it's not going to be COVID or the economy. It's going to be healing our country. And internationally, it's going to be reuniting people around the importance of democracy and human rights and the world order, and healing us domestically and internationally. And that's how I plan to spend the rest of my life.
And what about your former husband, Andrew Cuomo? Do you think he has the temperament to become a president?
I absolutely.
You do. And do you think he's going to run?
I don't know. You'd have to ask him.
And would you support him in his work?
Of course.
Excellent. Okay. And Kerry, now you have a couple of you have 3 daughters, and I understand that they're following in your footsteps. And if you want to give our audience a minute about them, that would be great, because we're wrapping this up very quickly, and everyone wants to hear about the next generation of Kennedys.
Oh, that's so sweet. So Cara is 25, and she works on international development issues and the investment industry, getting the investment, private equity, others to invest in anti-poverty work. Mariah has done this great Mask Up New York campaign and just got 20 very well-known New York designers like Michael Kors and others to make masks and encourage New Yorkers to use those masks and keep us all safe. And Michaela is working very hard on stopping violence against women. So they're all wonderful. I'm so proud of all of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry. This concludes Successful Philanthropy. Our featured guest was Kerry Kennedy. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.